If you've ever met a Santera or watched a Cuban godmother light a candle for Yemayá, you've already met the version of Cuba's African roots the whole world knows. Santeria is famous. It's in movies, in songs, in tourist brochures. But ask most people what the other half of Afro-Cuban religion looks like. The half practiced just as widely, just as seriously, in the same households, sometimes by the same people, and you'll get silence. That silence is exactly where this mystery lived for 200 years. And it took a genome study of 860 living Cubans to finally answer it. Here's the honest truth about how most of us learn Afro-Cuban history. Even Cuban families themselves, generation after generation. We learn about Santeria first, and often only, the Orishas, Chango, Yemayá, Ochun, names most of the diaspora can say without thinking twice. That's not an accident. Santeria, rooted in Yoruba tradition from what is now southwestern Nigeria, became the internationally visible face of Afro-Cuban spirituality, celebrated, studied, and eventually marketed to the world. But sit in the right living room in Havana, or in Miami, or in Union City, and you'll hear a second name spoken with the same reverence, sometimes in the very same breath. Palo Monte, or Regla Conga, built around the Ganga, a sacred vessel holding earth, bone, and spirit, tracing directly back to the Congo people of the Kongo Kingdom, in what is now Angola and the two Congos. For generations, Palo got treated almost like Santeria's quieter cousin, less studied, less photographed, less exported. Which raises the question this video actually exists to answer, honestly, using real data instead of assumption. Numerically, across the entire history of the slave trade to Cuba, which population, Yoruba or Bakongo, actually arrived in greater numbers? For 2 centuries, nobody had a real, complete answer. We do now, and if you have Cuban roots, what it says might genuinely surprise you the way it surprised us putting this together. Cuba's relationship with the slave trade lasted an almost unbelievably long time, longer than almost anywhere else in the Americas. The first enslaved Africans arrived as early as 1515. The last recorded arrivals came in 1873, nearly 360 years later. In total, historians estimate approximately 853,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the island across that entire span. Here's the detail that makes Cuba's story so different from almost every other island in this series. 92% of that entire number, the overwhelming majority, arrived during just the final 75 years of the trade, between 1801 and 1875. Most Caribbean islands built their African populations gradually, over a century or more, shaped by whichever African region was dominant during their own specific era of growth. Cuba built most of its African population in one intense, compressed final surge, right as the trade itself was being pushed underground by growing British and international pressure to abolish it. That timing matters enormously for understanding which African region actually shaped Cuba the most, because it means Cuba's population reflects, more heavily than almost anywhere else, whichever part of Africa was supplying the trade during its final, most desperate decades. Historians have documented at least 6 major African ethnic groups that arrived in Cuba in significant, sustained numbers, each known by their own specific name within the island itself. The Lucumí, meaning Yoruba-speaking peoples. The Mandingo. The Ganga, from Sierra Leone. The Arará, from Dahomey and the neighboring kingdom of Alada. The Carabalí, from the Calabar region around the Bight of Biafra. And the Congo, mainly Bakongo people from West Central Africa. Each of these populations arrived in genuinely different waves, shaped by different, specific crises, happening on entirely different timelines back in Africa. Between 1665 and 1760, the Kingdom of Congo was torn apart by a long civil war, a succession crisis between two rival royal dynasties, and that instability made enormous numbers of Bakongo people vulnerable to capture and sale. Historians estimate that between 1760 and 1790 specifically, the Bakongo made up 30% of Cuba's entire African-born population, the single largest group on the island during that period, arriving as a direct human consequence of a war most of us were never taught about in school. The Lucumí story unfolds on a completely different timeline. Significant Yoruba arrivals didn't really begin until the mid-1700s, and their numbers kept climbing as the Oyo Empire, once one of the most powerful states in West Africa, spent the early 1800s collapsing under the weight of internal rebellion and external invasion. That collapse flooded the coast with captives, and by the period after 1850, Yoruba-identified individuals had become the single largest group among all new arrivals to Cuba, at 34.5% of everyone brought over in that specific late window. Two populations, two completely different crises, an ocean apart, decades apart. And for 2 centuries, almost nobody had put both timelines together into one complete picture, until scientists finally sequenced the DNA of the people descended from both of them. The most complete answer came from a genome-wide study analyzing dense genetic data from 860 living Cuban individuals, sampled across the island's provinces, published in the scientific journal Nature Scientific Reports. Researchers weren't just asking whether Cuban DNA carried African ancestry. Everyone already knew it did. They were asking, with real statistical precision, which African populations that ancestry most closely matched, region by region, across the entire genome. The answer: West Central and Central African populations, the same broad region as the historical Bakongo and Kongo Kingdom, came back as the strongest, most consistent proxy source for the African ancestral component in the Cuban population as a whole. That finding lines up almost perfectly with the historical shipping data researchers compiled separately. West Central Africa accounted for 30% of all documented enslaved Africans brought to Cuba across the entire span of the trade, more than any other single region, including the Bight of Benin, the homeland of the Lucumí, which came in at just 14.2% of the total. The same study found something else worth knowing, especially if your own family comes from eastern Cuba specifically. Provinces in the east of the island, the region historically called Oriente, showed noticeably higher African ancestry overall, averaging 26% compared to 17% across the rest of Cuba, along with a distinct, more intense pattern of sex-biased admixture. European ancestry concentrated heavily in the paternal line, African and indigenous ancestry concentrated heavily in the maternal line. The same painful, documented pattern we've traced across nearly every island in this series. So here's the resolved mystery, laid out plainly. Across the full 360 years of the slave trade to Cuba, the Bakongo and the wider Congo-descended population arrived in greater cumulative numbers than any other single African group, and left the strongest overall genetic signature in the modern population as a result. The Lucumí, the Yoruba-descended population, whose spiritual tradition became the internationally famous face of Afro-Cuban religion, absolutely did become the single largest group during one specific, later, high-intensity window, the final decades before the trade ended. Both of those things are true at the same time, about the same island, and neither one cancels the other out. What actually happened is that Santeria's global visibility outran Palo's demographic weight, not because Palo's population was ever small, but because Yoruba tradition, arriving through a more centralized former empire, with a highly structured religious system, translated more easily into something outsiders could recognize, name, and eventually commercialize. Palo Monte, rooted in a more decentralized set of Bakongo spiritual practices, never got packaged the same way for the outside world, even though the people who carried it here may well have outnumbered the people who carried Santeria across the full history of the island. One honest note, the same kind we give in every video in this series. This is population-level historical and genetic evidence, not a guarantee about any one specific family. A Cuban family with deep Lucumí roots and a strong Santeria tradition is not wrong about their own specific ancestry just because Bakongo arrivals were larger island-wide. Both traditions are real, both populations are real, and what this video resolves is which one left the deeper mark on the island as a whole, not which one is more authentically Cuban. Neither is. They both are. This made you think about your own family, about which side of your own history you grew up hearing the most about, and which side maybe got quieter over the generations. We understand that feeling because it's exactly why this channel exists. That's exactly what our surname and record research service is built for. The link is pinned in the comments below. We go directly into the surviving colonial, church, and slave trade records tied to your specific surname, wherever they still exist, whether your family's roots run through Cuba or any other island we've covered across this entire series. And we tell you honestly what they show, and just as honestly, what they don't. This isn't the island-wide pattern we just spent the last several minutes resolving together. It's built around your own family's specific documented name, your own specific history, the story that's yours and nobody else's. Drop your surname and your province or region in Cuba, if you know it, in the comments below. It's exactly how past videos in this series got built, and it's exactly how future ones will too. For 2 centuries, the story most of the world learned about Afro-Cuban ancestry got told through its loudest, most visible chapter, the Orishas, the Santeria houses, the Yoruba names everyone eventually learns to say. That story is real. Nobody watching this video should walk away thinking otherwise. But it took a genome study of 860 living Cubans, laid directly against 360 years of shipping records, to finally show that the quieter tradition, the Ganga, the Bakongo ancestors, the Palo houses that never made it onto a tourist map, carried an equal, and by some measures even larger, share of the island's actual ancestry the whole time. If you're of Cuban descent, both of these threads, Lucumí and Congo, Santeria and Palo, are almost certainly woven into your own family somewhere, whether your own household leaned toward one, the other, both, or neither. Neither tradition needs the other's numbers to matter. They both survived the same crossing, carried by different people for different reasons, arriving at different moments in a trade that lasted longer on this one island than almost anywhere else in the hemisphere. We've now resolved this kind of long-standing, quietly unequal mystery on 2 islands in this series, Haiti and now Cuba. If you want us to look for the same kind of hidden imbalance between a famous tradition and a quieter one on another island next, tell us in the comments. And if uncovering the real, documented history hidden inside the African and Caribbean diaspora matters to you, subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel exists to do. One family, one record, one honest answer at a time.